Chad and I are here for a very special Chad and Mel event, but it is, for all intents and purposes, a Chad event. We are going to be discussing Chad's self-titled album, CHAD SIWIK, unpacking the story behind it and each of the tracks on this amazing, epic album. So we are going to dive right in.
Yes, well, I'm so happy to be doing this with you, Mel, because I wouldn't want to do it with anyone else. And Mel and I are super close friends, and she has all kinds of things going, Disney blogging and all kinds of things. But for you to agree to do this means a lot to me, so I appreciate it.
So happy to. I listened to the album over and over and over again, and I was almost in tears today because listening to Prince Lightmare and then listening to this, there is such a glow up and a grow up, and just it's such an amazing follow up to an already great album. But it's a testament to like the sophistication of your technical skills and your artistry. So I'm just so proud of you. Couldn't be more proud.
Oh, that's super high praise, and that means the world to me. I thank you so much.
So I am familiar with your first major album, Prince Lightmare, which debuted on August 16th, 2011, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
That, we're talking 10 years ago. Now, since then, you dropped the Dark EP, which had 4 tracks on it. 2, I think, were new tracks, and 2 were, 2 were unreleased. Do I have that right?
You're very close. 2 were like new versions of songs that were available, and then 4 were brand new tracks.
So since then, in 2016 and 2017, we got to see a lot of music videos along with that debut album, which are fantastic and are on your YouTube channel, which we'll link in the iCards and in the description. So my first big question for you is, it's been 10 years since the debut of Prince Lightmare in August of 2011. So at what point did you know you wanted to make the CHAD SIWIK album? And at what point did you really start to begin to conceptualize what you wanted it to be?
Well, it happened organically because I kind of never stopped making music, but I'm a huge fan of the album format, which a lot of independent artists aren't making, I think for good reason, because EPs are so accessible. There's so much more, it's shorter, like a 6-song format, so you can really like explore a theme really tightly and also captivate someone who has a lot of, everyone's attention span is so fractured right now.
Right.
So it makes the EP is the popular format now for most artists, and I think even like Miley Cyrus and all these people are making EPs. So I kind of stubbornly wanted to buck that trend a little bit because I am so obsessed with the album format from all of the artists that I grew up listening to, and I just was always in love with that format. This album isn't really like a concept album per se, as much like Prince Lightmare was, but however, every album just has a vibe that where it kind of all works together, right? So boy, it was super time consuming and a lot of hard work. So it's just even more of a feeling of accomplishment for those reasons. And I'm just really happy to put it out. Probably really throughout the last 5 years, I was still always making music, making, like you said, the EPs, the singles. So you just start making songs, and then you start to notice a pattern between songs, and it kind of happens just organically, believe it or not. That part is not as contrived as you would think. And then eventually there was a point like 4 songs in where I'm like, okay, there's a theme for this album, and the theme that emerged was telling the story of a relationship over a more of an extended period of time. So a lot of times people talk about, when love is new and you have that spark, and I think there's a song on here that we'll get to that is that moment. But then there's also, I've been in a long-term relationship now for quite a while, and I wanted to explore like the different parts of more of a long-term relationship. So this album kind of takes you on that journey, and it's not 100% sequential, but it does take you on, it's snapshots of a relationship over a long period of time. So that ended up being the concept, and then there's 1 or 2 songs that kind of jump out from that concept a little bit to explore different facets of what this album could be.
Yeah, I'm glad that you shared the storytelling element because that's what jumped out at me, and it's definitely a different chapter to the larger story of your music. There's definitely an evolution in what you have to say about romance and love, and you shared in interviews that you're heavily influenced by the pop stars of the 1980s, Madonna, Paula Abdul, and I want to invite you to tell us a little bit more about the people that influenced you, but more specifically, those influences clearly can be heard on your first album and can clearly be heard on CHAD SIWIK. So my question is, how have those stars, those artists, influence on you changed between that album and this one, if at all, and are there any new influences that you brought to bear on this album?
Well, I think Prince Lightmare was definitely more of a concept album, and I really wanted to hit the 80s. I really wanted to target that, and I even had, as you know, an alter ego, which is the namesake of the album, Prince Lightmare, who was the embodiment of the exploration of that decade for the album. And I think that for that reason, those 80s influences are just more obvious in that album. And then I think in an album like this, which is a more updated sound, it's a more relaxed version of me, a less conceptualized, just a more honest version, because there is no alter ego, it's just me. So when you kind of take that approach, it's just very different. It's a lot more intimate in terms of getting to know my actual personality through the music. It's less of a screen in front of me or a mask that I'm wearing. So it surprises me who people hear my music, because I'm always very open about like who I love so much and who has really influenced me growing up. Mainly as a kid, it was, of course, like you mentioned, Paula Abdul, Madonna, also Debbie Gibson were like huge for me growing up. And then into the 90s, it was always female singer-songwriters, but Tori Amos, Kate Bush, Alanis Morissette, and Fiona Apple in the 90s. And then, it opened up for me to more and more people after that, but those were like my hardcore influences. But I always feel like it's not for me to say who I sound like, it's for like an audience to say, because it's always really, that's a tricky question that artists get all the time, especially independent artists. Like, who do you sound like? Who is your influence? And it's tricky because you don't always sound like your influences necessarily, but they kind of do creep in. But it's always unexpected for me how someone interprets the music, because it's always heard differently by everyone. I think it's a very subjective art form. So I think the biggest difference between the two albums is that first one is so conceptualized and it does have that alter ego, and that the new one is, and I think that's why it's my namesake too. It's the self-titled album for that reason, is because it is so much more stripped down and I think honest in that way. So there's pros and cons to both of those approaches, but that's the main difference.
Yeah, it's really apparent that we're getting to hear CHAD SIWIK and not a persona on this album, which is really great. This album really invites your fans and new listeners in, and it does so well. You mentioned Prince Lightmare being kind of more of a conceptual album, and with exceptions to tracks like maybe Dark, which is very down-tempo, and Dreamscape Experiment, which is very conceptual, the album as a whole is very, very up-tempo, high-tempo, kind of synth pop. Whereas CHAD SIWIK is much more mid-tempo and, it's a different mood. So I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about if that was something that was intentional or if that kind of came to be more organically.
I think it is organic. I'm at a different place in my life now, and I think there's two sides to the answer to that question. The first I'll just say is that when I made Prince Lightmare, I was clubbing all the time. I was going to dance clubs. I was like living that dance club life. I was influenced by if you've ever seen the movie Party Monster, the side of it, not the dark side of the film, but the side of it that explores those club kids that were in New York City downtown in the 80s and 90s. They were like a huge influence for me, and I was kind of like living that. And I think now my life is so different from that. I don't go to the dance clubs that much, and I have much more of a home life. And so I think you see a little bit of maybe remembrance of those times, but you see the actuality of like how I am now. But I also want to just give a shout out to Luke Icard, who I created this album with, because I think he is the reason for some of those things too. And it started off like as just wanting to maybe collaborate because I was a bit of a control freak, and I think I basically did everything myself, and I felt like I took on maybe too much sometimes, and I just thought I want to see what it's like to let it be more of a collaboration and bring someone in. And so Luke and I have known each other since back then, and I've always wanted to create an album with him, and so he brought a lot of those vibes that you're hearing that I was like, yes, this is working. I'm really feeling this matches where I'm at, that type of thing. And so it was kind of like a coming together of both of our sensibilities in that way too.
Definitely a mood and a tonal shift, and it's absolutely beautiful.